talking about philosophy of science more than philosophy of physics, but this is a talk on philosophy of science, so it's entirely appropriate. Quantum interpretation, 20th century philosophy of science. If you've got a bit of 21st century,
Yeah. So I'm not a historian, and my chapter looks at the influence of quantum mechanics on philosophy of science from the logical empiricists onto Bell, but I'm only going to drill down into a specific thing today that I do cover in the chapter, but I've gone a little deeper into it, not nearly deep enough. I want to remind you of the thesis of Paul Foreman. This paper, Primer, Culture, Causality, and Quantum Theory, 1918-1927, adaptation by German physicists and mathematicians to a hostile intellectual environment. Some of you may know that Paul Foreman was a student of Thomas Kuhn and trained in physics. He interviewed a lot of quantum physicists for the American Institute of Physics. And the thesis is essentially that cultural values that are dominant in a given place and time, and it's just more than the zeitgeist, can influence the results of science. And in his case, it was looking at what happened with German intellectuals as they saw the collapse of the Wilhelmine Empire in 1918, Oswald Spengler and people like this, and somehow in Foreman's mind, this made the physicists and the mathematicians, even like Hermann Weyl, more conducive to quantum indeterminacy. Now, when I first read this, I was back in grad school, and about 10 years after it was written, and I thought it was a preposterous thesis. And as the older I've gotten, the more I realize it's not as preposterous as it once seemed. And so I'm going to try to do a little bit of a variation on it today, focusing on these characters. Paul Feyerabend, the philosopher of science, the infamous philosopher of science, David Bohm, here shown reading the Daily News on the day that the Communist Chinese took Shanghai, or the day after, I should say, and Leon Rosenfeld, who was, of course, one of the close associates of Niels Bohr, and a great defender in his own very peculiar way of what we could call the Copenhagen interpretation, although I don't think anybody but Rosenfeld had his own views about it. And in a little bit more detail, I have to consider these characters. I see that Stalin has been included. And I apologize for leaving out Louis de Broglie in a talk in Paris, but actually Bohm came to his theory independently of de Broglie, at least that's what he tells us. So I could leave him out on those reasons. But essentially the narrative here is going to consider what happened in the immediate post-war period with this man, Zhadanov, who was essentially Stalin's successor to be. He had been party secretary in Leningrad. He actually was the party commissar who ran the Red Army attack on Finland, which was a disaster. And he been rehabilitated, and he became the cultural czar of the Cold War on the side of Stalin. And it's this campaign of Zhadanov in 1946 and 1947 that led two physicists, Blokintsev and Terletsky, to write critical papers on the Copenhagen interpretation as bourgeois idealism. Bohm says that he came to his theory by reflecting on a paper by either Blokintsev or Terletsky, although in English, and by conversations with Einstein in Princeton. Well, we'll see that identifying that paper in English has been a real task, and I have not succeeded in doing it. to introduce the rest of the characters, Paul Feyerabend started out as a very loyal disciple of Karl Popper and critical rationalism, and changed very radically after his encounter with Leon Rosenfeld. In fact, with Rosenfeld's diatribes against Bohm's theory. Bohm and Feyerabend were colleagues in Bristol in the 1950s, the mid-1950s to late 1950s. And it was Rosenfeld's diatribes against Bohm that lead us to Feyerabend, and essentially to this rich garden of theoretical pluralism that Feyerabend will advocate for science by the end trajectory of his life in the famous book Against Method, which has gone through 4 editions and translated into something like 33 languages. This is one of the diatribes of Rosenfeld against Bohm. It's from an early paper in 1953. And what it says here is, the point of importance here is the necessity with which the concept of complementarity is imposed on us. We are not here in the presence of an idea which we can either accept or reject according to whether it conforms to this or that philosophical criteria. It concerns uniquely an adaptation of our ideas to an experimental new situation in the domain of atomic physics. It is entirely on the plane of experience that we can judge if its conceptions, its new conceptions, are adequately serving their function. So entirely on the domain of experience that we judge the Copenhagen interpretation. And Rosenfeld would go on to say that there really is no alternative to Copenhagen in 1953 and in many later papers, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. Here's Feyerabend's ultimate response to that kind of univocality of scientific messaging. Unanimity of opinion may be fitting for a rigid church, for the frightened or greedy victims of some ancient or modern myth, or for the weak and willing followers of some tyrant. Variety of opinion is necessary for objective knowledge. And a method that encourages variety is also the only method that is compatible with a humanitarian outlook. I want to suggest to you that these 2 quotations, one is the result of the other. In fact, that pluralism of Feyerabend comes from essentially his response and horror at the dogmatism with which Rosenfeld was defending the Copenhagen interpretation in Rosenfeld's own version of the Copenhagen interpretation. So I'm going to start with these details about Bohm from Alival's fantastic biography. He joined the Communist Party of the US while he was a grad student at Berkeley, a student of Robert Oppenheimer. And he was an avid reader of Marx, Engels, and Lenin. His fellow grad student Joe Weinberg was interviewed many years later, who said that Bohm actually read Engels' Dialectics of Nature in the original German. Now, the original German text was only assembled in the 1930s from manuscripts that Engels left, and it had been immediately translated by communist publications all over the world. But Bohm read it in German as a graduate student, Dialectics of Nature. He became assistant professor at Princeton University in 1947, and this was the period of the McCarthyite paranoia in the United States. And he was called before the House on Un-American Activities Committee, headed by Joseph McCarthy, and he took the Fifth Amendment, that is the constitutional right in the United States not to testify against it. In 1950, he was indicted for contempt of Congress, and thereafter Princeton did not renew his contract. Princeton behaved very shamefully. Even John Wheeler, who was not in any way sympathetic to left-wing ideas. On the contrary, thought that Princeton had behaved in a very shameful way with regard to war. It's not on my screen. Can you get rid of that? Is there anyone here who can get rid of this? Thank you. Well, having some free time from being relieved of his duties at Princeton, Bohm had time to think, and in that time he came up with his first version of his theory anyway, his hidden variable theory, which appeared in January 1915, January 15, 1952. Here's the theory. And it was written sometime, again, according to Olivo's biography, between the end of 1950 and June 1951. Now, what's all this got to do with the Ruskies and with dialectical materialism? Here's a letter of Bohm from October, December 1951, in a collection of letters, a very interesting collection of letters that was published in 2017, to a Berkeley graduate student that he'd known, who became a mathematician, was the wife of a physicist. And he says here to her, and he's writing here from Brazil, a clear, sharp, optimistic, materialistic point of view, providing infinite possibilities of development and the possibility of growth of a common human purpose, having objective existence within the human race as a developing thing, would have far more appeal, particularly if it could be backed up or backed by some striking success in dealing with nature. It would be a powerful talking point to be able to say the old, tired, disorganized, defeatist, negativist, so-called positivist point of view failed. Obviously because it closed our eyes to all the possibilities in nature at the atomic level. How much more do we expect it to be the same at the human level? At both levels, progress is possible only if we adopt an optimistic, dialectic, forward-looking point of view. Dialectical because it must take into account the infinite possibilities for development that flow out of the opposition of all the opposing elements in the universe. Even a beginner in discourse analysis could see that this is just paraphrasing Engel's dialectics of nature. And then he writes to Yevig again right after his theories come out. Why in 25 years didn't someone in the USSR find a materialist interpretation of quantum theory? So Bohm gives his own account of the origins of his theory. Lokintsev and Terlecki made it clear that it's not necessary to adopt the interpretation of Bohr and Heisenberg, and showed instead one may consistently regard the current quantum theory as an essentially statistical treatment. That was Lokintsev's ensemble interpretation, which would eventually be supplemented by a more detailed theory permitting a more nearly complete treatment of the behavior of an individual system. They did not, however, actually propose any specific theories or models for the treatment of the individual system. Then in 1951, partly as a result of the stimulus of discussions with Dr. Einstein, the author began to seek such a model, and indeed shortly thereafter, he found a simple causal explanation of the quantum mechanics, which, as he later learned, had already been proposed by de Broglie in 1927. So the intellectual origins of Bohm's theory are either in, or both, with discussions with Einstein and his dissatisfaction with quantum theory as a purely statistical theory, as he saw it, and in some paper by Lokintsev or Terlecki. We'll go to that. This is now in the literature. In Max Jammer's book, stimulated by his discussions with Einstein and influenced by an essay which, as he told the present author, was written in English and probably by Lukintsev or some other Russian theorist like Terletsky, and which criticized Bohr's approach, Bohm began to study the possibility of introducing hidden variables. And then he notes that Bohm has forgotten the exact title and author of this paper. Yammer continues on a 70th birthday fest trip for Bohm. After sending Einstein his book Quantum Theory, Einstein invited Bohm to discuss the matter in detail. These discussions and the accidental reading of an article written by Lukintsev or somebody else, we've lost Terletsky, were a turning point for Bohm. Jim Cushing, in his book on the development of hidden variable theories from De Broglie to Bohm, it is by his own recollection, Bohm was stimulated to rethink his conventional position on quantum theory when, in 1951, he read a paper by Lukintsev or Terletsky critical of Bohr's approach. Now that is in accord with what Bohm himself says in Causality and Chance in Modern Physics in 1957. And then Cushing adds, well, David Bohm confirmed this for me in an interview in London in July of 1989. And then Olival continues the story. Later, Yammer reiterated the story in a kind of festschrift for Bohm's 70th birthday. Bohm never contested it. This information, however, raised, as Yammer himself had noted, Bohm had forgotten the exact title and author of this paper, and there was no paper either by Lukintsev or Terletsky published in English before Bohm's shift to the causal interpretation. And that I've tried to verify. There's been no paper published in English prior to Bohm's theory. I happen to work at Stanford, where the Hoover Institution is, which has one of the largest collections of documents of the U.S. Communist Party, and I have spent hours pouring through old communist paraphernalia, including the intellectual journals like Political Affairs, Science and Society, whatever they have. I have not found one paper by Lukintsev or Terletsky or an English summary translated from the Russian of this. So it's very curious. But Bohm certainly learned about Lukintsev and Terletsky's objections to the Copenhagen interpretation and their condemnation of Copenhagen as bourgeois idealism. Indeed, the papers by the Soviets criticizing complementarity were first translated and published in French, not in English, and this in 1952, while Bohm's shift to the causal interpretation occurred in 1951. So let's look a little bit at these gentlemen. The more significant physicist was Lukintsev. He headed a large research institute at Dubna, north of Moscow. And Terletsky here was also a quantum physicist. And they were working in the period when Zhadanov was thought to be the successor in waiting to Joseph Stalin. And he was indeed the propagandist in chief of the Soviet Union from 1945 to his death in 1948. There's some speculation that he was murdered, although it's never been documented definitely. Lots of speculation about his demise. His son married Stalin's daughter, Svetlana. He was quite close to Stalin. He got his own stamp, that's a big thing. And he created this period called Zhadanovshchina, this period of ideological purification in the Soviet Union, which started in 1946. It says that the world is divided into two camps, imperialistic and democratic, and the only thing that the main principle of the Zhadanov doctrine was summarized by the phrase, the only conflict that is possible in Soviet culture is the conflict between the good and the best. I'm going to focus in on this speech that he gave to the Conference of Soviet Philosophical Workers in Moscow on the 24th of June, 1947. And this speech was translated into English in the U.S. Communist Party journal Political Affairs in 1948. Well, you don't have to read all of it, it's just in the red. An example of Bolshevik struggle against the opponents of materialism is Lenin's book, Materialism and Imperial Criticism, in which every sentence is like a piercing sword, annihilating an opponent. The Kantian vagaries of modern bourgeois atomic physicists leads them to inferences about the electrons possessing, quote, free will, unquote, to attempts to describe matter as only a certain conjunction of waves and other devilish tricks. Here is a colossal field of activity for our philosophers. Well, and he ends this with a quote from Engels on Ludwig Feuerbach. I'll call attention to this one other passage. Soviet philosophical publications are often scholastic and conciliatory rather than creative and militant. They stop short of developing Marxist doctrine further and fighting against idealist perversions. Okay, so where were these idealist perversions in Russia? Moishe Markov, a young physicist, wrote in this journal that had just started, Problems of Philosophy, in 1947, a discussion of the measurement problem in which the Copenhagen interpretation was presupposed. He does say that we can avoid subjective language in using the Copenhagen interpretation, and that should be done. But the article was attacked by Terlecki, among others, and it caused the editor of the journal to be forced to resign. Leading the attack was this paper of Terlecki, where he said the Copenhagen interpretation is Marxist in spirit. Now, code for that is that it's against Lenin's book, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. And he says that Marx simply followed bourgeois scientists in making complementarity the basis of quantum dynamics. We don't have to spend time with that. That's the main paper, but that occurred after Bohm's theory appeared. Let's turn to Blakinsa's book. First edition of his Principles of Quantum Mechanics came out in 1944. The second edition in 1949. The second edition now has a preface in which he says the idealistic conceptions of quantum mechanics, which are now widespread abroad, are subjected to criticism. Blah, blah, blah. He got the Stalin Prize for the second edition of his Principles of Quantum Mechanics in 1950. Now we turn to Rosenfeld, who was a Marxist of his own side, but not a Stalinist. And in this review in Nature of Bohm's 1957 book, Causality and Chance, he writes and concludes, I'll just briefly summarize here, that such irrational dogmatists should hurl the very accusation of irrationality and dogmatism at the defenders of the common sense, uncommitted attitude of other scientists is the crowning paradox, which gives a touch of comedy to a controversy so distressingly pointless and untimely. And some years just after that, Feyerabend had had enough, and he wrote a belated review of Bohm's 1957 book, where he compares the defenders of Copenhagen to the more dogmatic of the medieval scholars, the sole exception being the latter followed Aristotle, not Bohr. And in that review from 1960 in the British Journal for Philosophy of Science, a belated review, 3 years after the book appeared, we find many themes that Feyerabend will subsequently develop and will essentially define his philosophical career, articulated for the first time. I don't need to read these in the interest of time. There are quite a number of them. Alternatives, even opposing concepts, what he called counterinduction, is preferred to theoretical monism. We have to broaden empiricism to allow for experimental results that might be even incommensurable. And this is the origin, actually, of the work that Feyerabend did on Galileo in the Tower, which is so famous in Against Method, where he essentially argues that Galileo only succeeded against the scholastics because he used rhetorical means. The data actually supported Galileo no more than they did. In fact, the data supported the scholastics, the observable data. And there's a nasty footnote that is contra to Rosenfeld here, and I won't linger on that. So that is the story that I have to tell, and I think that you can trace this trajectory of Feyerabend's career and the enormous influence it had on the development of what we now call theoretical, methodological, all kinds of different pluralisms in philosophy of science, which have come about, mushroomed after a rain, following Against Method. Now, I said I carry my story into the 21st century. Why is that? Because you now find things like this. As you live in the Bay Area, as I do, you sometimes take walks in Berkeley, and you see this in nearly every front yard. Signs like this. Now you can agree or disagree with many things on this yard sign, but science is real. What do we make of that? What does that mean? It means, and of course, it means trust the experts. As a public, admonition, it means trust the experts. And what does that lead to? That leads to statements like this letter to Lancet in the early period of COVID, March 7th, 2020, where the first discussions were of what was the origin of the COVID virus. Was it possibly a leak from a lab in Wuhan? And some 20 different virologists, people of significance in the scientific community, were orchestrated to write this one letter to Lancet. And among other things, it says this: the rapid, open, and transparent sharing of data on this outbreak is now being threatened by rumors and misinformation around its origins. So I think we need Feyerabend's attitude more than ever in philosophy of science. Thank you.
Thanks for your talk. I wanted to comment on the Turlesky-Bloshinsev connection. I, like you, have struggled in vain to find any paper they might have written that Bohm read that may have inspired him. And in fact, Bohm, this will be familiar to the historians in the room, recollections, even a few years later, are notoriously unreliable. So Bohm actually gives 3 stories of how he came to his paper in later years. One is the Turlesky-Bloshinsev possible. They might have been the authors. The other one is the discussion with Einstein. And later in life, and he conveyed this to Basil Hiley, and communicated himself in the 80s, he'd been working on alternative interpretations even as he was finishing the textbook, before even discussing the matter with Einstein. We should be suspicious of later recollections. Even the best of us can misremember. But I will say this: the best piece of evidence I've found, or the one closest to the moment in question, is a letter he wrote to the French communist Evry Schatzman in 1952 in September, which is not very much later, and it's clear in that letter that it's exclusively the discussion with Einstein. There's no mention of a Russian author. He says, I walked into the room, the discussions with Einstein, pretty much of the view that quantum mechanics was okay, the Bohr view. In fact, it adopted his dialectical materialistic view to complementarity in those early years. And it was through Einstein's discussions that he gradually came around. That's at least what he reports in September 52. The story would change over the next few years. So it's a comment rather than a question, but just
Yeah.
to raise it. Yeah.
So good to have questions. So
Yeah.
It is related to this comment. But first, thank you very much for the wonderful research you did at the Hoover institution, checking.
Not my favorite thing.
Yeah. Anyway, I have a guess, different guess about what Bohm read at that time. My guess is that he read a free translation of these papers, which probably were largely circulated among American communists at the time, but it was not published. So I take Bohm's testimony, except for the idea that these papers were published. They possibly were not published. They just circulated as free translation, which was very common in every clandestine or every marginal organization in the world, not only at that time,
Right.
but to today.
Right. No, there are many free translations of Zhdanov's work in political affairs on the world situation. You can imagine what that said in 1947, 1948. But I can find nothing as a free translation of a paper of either Terlecki or Blokhincev. Now, perhaps the Stalin Prize was awarded for Blokhincev's book only in 1950. That seems too late. I think it has to be something before, from 1948, possibly as early as 1947. Bohm was a Stalinist at that time, as you rightly point out. He was very much among the ideologically pure, and I think he was listening to that lecture, perhaps, he read it, of Zhdanov in 1946 to the philosophers from 1947, and he decided that, okay, quantum mechanics needs a materialist philosophy. Let's see what we can do.
We really have only 1 minute left. If there's a question.
There's a remark on this.
A remark, a complimentary remark. Feyerabend defends pluralism, okay? He's a proponent of pluralism.
Right.
But this is also one way of seeing things in reality, because we need balance. So if we have only pluralism, then we have destruction of society. We need unity and multiplicity. Neither only unity, nor only multiplicity. We need the composition of these two opposites to make a balanced and constant society.
Okay. The other influence on Feyerabend's views was John Stuart Mill, his book on liberty. And what Mill says is that what we always need is more information, and reasonable people will find the right conclusion. That happens to be Feyerabend's view, I think. Although he read Mill and brought these things to bear only in 1970, long before that 1960 review of Bohm's book, where he outlines the progress or the promise of a liberalized empiricism without dogmas.
Okay, so on that note, we'll thank our speakers.
I'm going to go break and
No,
you'll
coffee.
appear.